worried that it might backfire and get me in more trouble for trying to use influence. Dallas didn't understand, perhaps because the only person who could help us was truly Uncle Dave. If my uncle was really the only one standing in our way, no amount of persuasion on my part would have made a difference. I tried to rationalize the objections to the wedding at face value, telling Linda many times that my parents didn't need to be at my wedding, and neither did Uncle Larry. Problem solved. Linda didn't care. She wasn't the one calling the shots. Finally, after months of nonsensical excuses about Uncle Larry, Dallas and I went out 2D and had sex out of wedlock. If anyone was aware of the consequences of an out 2D, it was me. But I did it anyway. Dallas and I wanted to be together beyond any repercussions. If consequences arose, we would address them when the time came. In my mind, having sex with Dallas was not wrong, no matter what policy said. As far as I was concerned, no one was going to find out anyway. Only the two of us knew about the out 2D, and I assumed our secret was safe. We were young, in love, and committed to being married. It was the church that was not allowing us to move forward with our relationship. I knew that out 2D was bad if you were engaging in adultery or were promiscuous. But in our case, we were in a committed relationship, and we'd been dating for months. We were the ones trying to follow the rules and get married, while they were simply coming up with excuses about why we couldn't move forward. We'd wanted to do the right thing, and they'd made that impossible. We were all too aware that following their rules put happiness out of reach, so we did what we wanted and what we felt was right for us. To hell with the consequences. I didn't feel an ounce of guilt, and managed to withhold the incident for weeks. Dallas, however, eventually caved under questioning, as he now thought we had done something wrong. One day in early June, after intense pressuring, he confessed it all to Mr. H., who, of course, was shocked by the admission. She had been clever in the questioning, but she hadn't thought it would ever uncover anything. She confronted me next, and she was already calm, to me indicating she had already processed her shock. I told her I didn't feel bad about it, only that we had been caught. Of course, I was extremely angry at Dallas for talking, but that conversation would be had later. For now, I told Mr. H. that the fault of the out 2D was squarely on whoever wouldn't let us get married. Surprisingly, she didn't disagree. She was just upset and anxious about what would happen next. No Sea Org members got away with an out 2D, and Dallas and I certainly weren't going to be the first, although I might have been the first not to feel bad about it. I was immediately placed under watch, where someone was supposed to follow me. Mr. H. told me that I was going to be in big trouble. I could tell that she was even scared for me. "Where is Dallas?" I asked Mr. H. I was fully aware that when out 2Ds occur, the first thing that happens is that the offenders are separated and often sent to different continents, or at least different bases, to do the RPF and never see each other again. Mr. H.'s answer was very disturbing but unsurprising. She told me I didn't need to know, that I shouldn't even be thinking about him, given the amount of trouble I was in. All I could really focus on was that if I didn't find Dallas, I would likely never see him again. I was terrified and furious all at once. Sea Org rules and policies demanded that I sit there quietly and do whatever I was told at times this grave, but I simply couldn't do it. "Where the fuck is he?" I demanded of Mr. H. She was shocked and said she didn't know. "Bullshit!" I yelled, not sparing words. I stormed out of her office and started opening doors up and down the hall trying to find him. I went downstairs and checked the bus, asking his friends along the way if they had seen him, but they hadn't. I was being tailed by someone who kept calling at me to stop, but I went to every room in the entire HGB looking for him. Next, I walked 2 miles to the Hollywood Inn, but he wasn't there either. I saw my life falling apart all over again. This time, I sure as hell wasn't going to let it happen. Just then, the Hollywood Inn security guard told me I had a phone call in the office off the lobby, so I ran in hoping it was Dallas, only to find Mr. Rathbun standing there in person looking very serious. I was briefly ashamed that the second most important person in the church had to come here to deal with me and my out 2D, but I was over trying to do right by RTC. They fucked up everything in my life. All I wanted was to be allowed to get married and be assigned a post in the Sea Org for my value, not because of who my uncle was. I was exhausted from always having to be sec-checked because of my family name and the church's paranoia-driven PR. Other people in my situation would have either been in or out, cut off from their family or not. I was in a constant in-between, which was a complete mindfuck. Mr. Rathbun tried to sit me down. "Jenna, I know what's been happening," he said, trying to shame me into submission. "You just need to come clean right now." It was obvious to me that he was interpreting my behavior as wild animal reaction, the most well-known symptom of a missed withhold. Clearly, he thought he could calm me down by having me come clean to him. However, I was in no mood to come clean. I just wanted to know where Dallas was. "He is being dealt with," was all he would give me. I pushed out of the office, unwilling to deal with his mind games. It was now dark as I walked the 2 miles back to the HBG to continue my search for Dallas. While charging down the sidewalk, I heard the sound of a car engine slowing down behind me and the voice of Mr. Rathbun yelling for me to get in, saying we needed to talk. After some convincing, I finally got in, thinking he'd tell me where Dallas was. Mr. Rathbun was rambling on about not knowing how this whole thing had gotten so far out of control. Now, however, he said he had no choice but to report my actions to Aunt Shelley and Uncle Dave. I couldn't believe that he thought I was so naive that I didn't think they already knew everything. I didn't challenge him, though. I just told him that I didn't see what any of it had to do with them. Another Sea Org member wouldn't have had to endure the scrutiny and level of security that I did. Mr. Rathbun agreed, but he was clearly torn between feeling he was supposed to be yelling at me and understanding my dilemma and feeling sympathetic in a way very similar to Mr. H. He drove up to the top of Mulholland Drive until he finally stopped the car at a scenic overlook so we could get some air. This was the first time I had ever been on this road. With all of Los Angeles lit up in front of us, Mr. Rathbun seemed to think that I would calm down, but when I didn't suddenly melt into submission because of the gorgeous view, he became furious and began yelling at me that I was an SP. We started screaming at each other again, and he got so pissed off that he got back in his car and drove off. Now I was stranded in the middle of God knows where, having gotten no closer to finding Dallas. I didn't even know I was on Mulholland Drive. Luckily, I spied a couple of lovers up the hill from me, who, from their appearance, had seen the entire argument. Trying to look as normal as I could in a Sea Org uniform with my eyes red and swollen, I approached them to see if I could please borrow a phone. The girl in the pair, obviously feeling bad for me, handed me hers. I thanked her, looked at it, then looked back at her, suddenly realizing that I had absolutely nobody to call. Chapter 27. The Edge. I stared out at the San Fernando Valley, trying to figure out what to do next. I started walking down the road toward Los Angeles. I was about 15 minutes along when Mr. Rathbun came back for me. This time I got into the car without argument. "Look," Mr. Rathbun began, "if you do your program, you will see Dallas again." I had no idea what my program was going to be, but I knew it would consist of countless sec checks at the very least. "I'll do it," I replied, but only because of how much I love Dallas. "I understand. I just want what's best for you." We sat in silence for a bit before finally starting back toward the base. Before he dropped me off, we stopped at the Celebrity Center, where he had to drop off a hugely important auditing folder from a session he had with Tom Cruise. "When I get out of this car, please don't take off," he said. "I will be right back." Tempting as it was, I was exhausted. Besides, there was no point in bolting. Where would I go? By the next morning, I had calmed down enough to think rationally and decided I would cooperate, go in session, and try to get through whatever program was required of me. For the next 5 days, I went in session with Sylvia Pearl from the Office of Special Affairs, which operated like a kind of secret police known for sec-checking people who were security risks. The video camera in her room was pointed right at me. In the sec check, she started with a question she already knew the answer to. Had I had sex with Dallas? She then proceeded to ask me about every single aspect of it. Where, when, how many times, how long, in excruciating detail. Although the probing questions were expected, as this was a sec check, I still found them disturbing and invasive. Not only were they intended to be demeaning, they were also designed to make me feel violated. The hallmark of a good security checker was his or her willingness to invade privacy, and Sylvia Pearl did it commendably. It felt wrong to cooperate with something that was clearly intended to be used against me and to control me. As if having my most intimate moments exposed to Sylvia weren't bad enough, I knew that there were unseen eyes in the room with me. Most likely, there was somebody watching through the camera in the room or somebody who would watch the video later. Then, of course, somebody else would read my session worksheet. I felt nauseated just thinking about how many people would learn about my private life before the day was out. The exercise was supposedly for my own good, but this institutional voyeurism was too much for me. All this interrogation did was to make me doubt the purpose of the whole ordeal. It would be one thing if I simply had to confess what I'd done and repent, but the additional details could not have served any purpose. According to Scientology, the more details you gave, the more relief you were supposed to get. But after everything I'd revealed, I didn't feel relieved. I felt used. They seemed committed to making me repent for my out 2D and for my behavior, and to admit that I was wrong. It would have been easier for me if I thought I was wrong. However, for reasons that I couldn't describe, that were out of my control and beyond my understanding, I couldn't submit in the way in which they asked of me, and in which I had in the past. When I wasn't in session, I would ask where Dallas was, assuming that he was going through the same process somewhere else. After 5 days, I was given permission to write him a letter, but Mr. H still had me change a few things after she read through it. 2 days later, I got a letter back, which was just a few lines long and didn't sound like Dallas. In short, he was getting through his program, I should do mine, and he loved me. The brevity of the letter worried me more than the content did. After a few more days of questions from Sylvia, I found my attitude changing. Whereas earlier I had resented the questions yet answered them, suddenly cooperating in any way became a struggle. Sitting in the auditing room waiting to begin the questioning, I wasn't sure I could handle another round of confessing in front of an audience. "Could you please turn off the camera?" I asked Sylvia. All I wanted was a bit of privacy. I was going to do the session, but I just needed some help or comfort, at the very least a one-on-one conversation. "No," she said, leaving it at that. When she began to ask questions, I just shut down, refusing to talk to her. I had nothing to say. I couldn't find any words to say that she would listen to anyway. As she became increasingly impatient, all I could think about was leaving the room and how much I needed to get out of there. The only problem was, I wasn't allowed to go anywhere. I got up to leave the room. Sylvia wouldn't allow me. She was strong and clearly prepared, even though she was at least 50. I tried to escape her grasp for at least 15 minutes until I promised not to run if she just let me go to the back stairwell. It was the least confrontational way in which I could handle the situation. She eased up, and that's when I made my move. I got by the first security guard, but he radioed someone to get to the bottom of the stairs, 4 flights down. Practically jumping down a flight at a time, I beat the next guard to the exit. Once I was on Hollywood Boulevard and out in public, I was untouchable. No one would dare make a scene. I started walking down the street. Then I noticed that Sylvia had found me and was following me. Jenna, wait! Stop!" she shouted over the sounds of passing cars. "Get away from me!" I yelled back. "I'm not going back. I'm going to find Dallas." Beginning with the Hollywood Inn, I checked every floor, asking anyone I saw if they'd seen him. Back at the HGB, I charged up to Mr. H's office. "Where is he?" I demanded. She didn't even open her mouth to respond, just simply looked at me. We studied each other for a minute, waiting to see what the other would do next, until I made it clear that the rapport we'd built over the last several months was gone. I'm going to find him. And you know what else? I'm never going to sit down for another session so somebody can get off on my sex stories. I'm through with that. She shut the door in my face, and I tried knocking. She wouldn't answer, so I knocked louder and louder, raising my voice until with nothing to lose I got a running start and crashed my body into her door, which burst open on my second try despite the deadbolt. Her fed-up expression was replaced with shock. She just stood and watched as I began grabbing at the papers scattered around her office, looking for clues as to where he might be. In one of the piles, I discovered a report from someone who had been security checking him. It included all the explicit details of our intimate encounter, which didn't surprise me, but it was unnerving just the same. Glancing at one of the pages, I saw the name of his auditor, Tessa, in the Office of Special Affairs. With Mr. H still standing there, I ran downstairs to the OSA auditing rooms looking for Tessa. Nobody in OSA would tell me where she was, so I waited for her outside the building. A few minutes later, Tessa and another woman emerged from the front door of the HGB and started walking to a car. I followed them, demanding that they tell me where Dallas was, but they refused to talk to me. They drove off, advising me that I should stop worrying about Dallas and take care of myself. For the next 2 weeks, I continued my search for Dallas, enduring exhausting days of combing through Sea Org buildings in LA and hoping to find where they'd stashed him. Wearing my regular Sea Org uniform, I'd wander the halls, quietly doing my own detective work to see what I could discover. While I wasn't smashing down doors or sprinting down the street, with each passing day I became more agitated and my resolve grew. Though my approach had little to show for it, my investigation gave me time to look back at the last several weeks and consider their treatment of me, treatment that in many ways had been unusual. Once upon a time, an outburst like the one I'd had with Sylvia in the auditing room would have easily landed me a severe punishment, most likely RPF. Instead, they made constant threats of putting me on RPF, but it appeared to be all talk and little follow-through. If there had been a time to crack down on me, it would have been after that session with Sylvia. Instead, here I was, walking through the corridors of Pac Base. Although someone was following me, she was not trying to stop me. The disconnect in their actions was hard to understand and made me wonder what was going on behind the scenes. Clearly there was conflict on their side. They seemed to want to punish me, but something seemed to be preventing them from actually doing so. It didn't take much to see that most likely my parents factored into all this. After all, if the church put me on RPF, they'd have to explain that to my parents, who likely would not be thrilled, not to mention anyone else who would wonder why a Miss Cabbage was disobedient enough to get the church's most severe punishment. While my family was surely part of it, it didn't seem like the whole story. After all, I'd refused to accept my punishment for the out 2D. Anyone aware of that knew I was in a major violation of the mores of the group, and instead of contrition, I gave them spite. Yet their actions seemed to show a larger ambivalence on their part, almost as though they could not make up their minds about how to deal with the situation. Perhaps, in the end, the powers that be knew the reality as well as I did. I would not accept being sent to the RPF. They already had Dallas, and I didn't feel I had much else to lose. I would have sooner called the police and filed a missing person report on Dallas than submit to another punishment that I didn't deserve. Though I doubted that they had any remorse about preventing Dallas and me from getting married, it seemed like at the very least they didn't know what to do about it now. To allow us to wed now would essentially condone our actions. They couldn't punish us for an out 2D and let us stay together. Instead, they seemed to think they could just keep us apart until I decided to give up. As my persistence was making clear, that was not going to happen. Finally, I grew so desperate and depressed that I went back to Mr. H for help. It didn't take long for our conversation to escalate into a screaming argument that ended with her slamming the door in my face again. Undeterred, I broke it down a second time, even though it had just been fixed. Within minutes, 3 security guys grabbed me by the arms and legs, pulled me into a small room, and held me down. Even then, I tried breaking free as best I could. I kicked one of them in the balls and almost got away. My bad behavior must have been reported up the chain of command, because 2 days later I got a phone call from Greg Wilher, a top executive in RTC, who said he was already en route from INT to see me. He made a deal with me. If I stopped going nuts, he'd let me talk to Dallas. A few minutes later, he kept his end of the bargain. I was on the phone with Dallas. I quickly broke down in tears, the emotion of the moment and my exhaustion being too much to control. Dallas was on the verge of tears himself, but something sounded wrong in his voice. He was being very weird and deliberate in what he said. There were exceptionally long, extremely noticeable pauses in his speech. I knew that someone was standing over him and telling him what to say, a very common practice for people in trouble. It only made me angrier. I wanted to see him face to face. I was furious that they felt like they owned us. "Tell me where you are," I demanded. "Jenna, I can't," he said, before another long pause. "I'm going through the program. I'm getting there bit by bit. If I finish this, the word is that we can be together again." "Do you believe that?" I asked him. "I think there is a chance, and that is all I have right now," he said rather hopelessly. "Just tell me where you are," I begged. I'd been through too much to simply leave it to chance, but he was adamant. "I can't tell you where I am." I felt a flush of anger. I had risked so much trying to find him, yet his loyalty seemed to be more with the church than with me. Despite my best efforts, the church, it seemed, had already won. He was their puppet, and they seemed to be enjoying throwing this in my face. Hysterical and desperate, I took the phone with me and climbed halfway out the window. "Listen, Dallas, and whoever else is also listening to this, if someone doesn't tell me where you are, I'm going to jump out the 5th floor window. I'm serious." "Jenna, I can't tell you," he said. Standing on a ledge 5 stories up and looking down on the cars speeding by, I couldn't believe it had come to this. It was starting to get dark, and the wind tugged at the hairs of my sweater, the streetlights below merging into a blur. I had no control over anything, but the prospect of taking my own life was a way to change that. I knew that the church had great fear about what happened when someone died or committed suicide on their watch. They didn't need another PR flap. They would likely do anything to prevent it, especially after Lisa McPherson. This was my last-ditch effort to regain what they'd taken from me, to use the only leverage I felt that I had left, their fear of bad PR and my own life. Still, Dallas refused to reveal his whereabouts. I was just hanging up when Mr. Wilhere called someone else in the office asking for an update. He had someone tell me Dallas was coming over now, and I would see him. So I came inside. Finally, someone had taken me seriously enough to let me see Dallas. About an hour later, Dallas got off the elevator, looking miserable and worried. I wanted to hug him, but all at once my feelings of fury came raging back. "Where have you been?" I demanded through tears. "Why haven't you been looking for me?" "I'm sorry, Jenna, I just can't tell you." With those words, the relief that I'd felt upon seeing him evaporated, and all that was left was the painful reality of the choices he'd made. He could say he wanted to be with me, but when he'd been forced to choose between me and the church, between my safety and obeying orders, we both knew that he'd chosen the church. I had finally found him, but somehow he was already lost. It was more than I could take. I started throwing punches at him. He was bigger and stronger, so my actions were futile, which angered me even more. And so for the second time that night, I stepped out onto the ledge. I know now that people who have been abandoned feel the need to test people in their lives by seeing what they will do, seeing if they will abandon them like everyone else if pushed hard enough. Thinking back to that night, it's difficult to say whether I was testing him, them, or myself. I still don't know if I really was going to jump each time I took up my 5-story perch, but what I do know was that in that moment, as I stood outside the window, I experienced the pain of every loss I'd faced at the hands of the church over and over again. My parents, my brother, my friends. If the church was going to take Dallas too, then maybe jumping out the window wasn't such a bad idea. The sky was darkening, but I tried to look down, not up, as I contemplated my next step. I wondered how much it would hurt, or whether I would die instantly. I pushed aside thoughts of pain, and thought about the Thetan that was me, which somehow I still believed in. And yet, instead of giving me strength to continue in this life, the idea of that Thetan pushed me in the other direction, as I realized that if I died, I would simply come back in another body. There was comfort in that. Comfort in ending it all to start again, maybe with a new family. After all, I was in this for 1 billion years. What was so bad about throwing one life away? when apparently I had thousands to lose. Dallas finally realized how serious I was when I asked him if I would die. His eyes filled with tears, and taking my hand, he promised to tell me where he had been and what had been happening. With his promise, I let him pull me in through the window and we embraced. Maybe my life did matter to him after all. He told me he was being kept at PAC, in the basement under full-time watch, doing manual labor such as demolition and laying tiles, and had been getting security checked all the while. He said that in the letters he had written me, he was instructed what to say and to make it sound like his own words, just as I had suspected. He said that our brief phone call had been monitored by Linda, who had told him what he could and couldn't say. The threat they were holding over his head was that if he didn't cooperate, he would be declared a suppressive person and would never see his family or me again. He said he was just trying to do right by everyone. I wanted to feel relief, knowing that Dallas did think my life was important enough to break at least one rule. I could see that he was really hurt, that he had been in a horrible bind and didn't know what to do, and for that I felt as though I was the worst person in the world, which I had always been told that I was. Still, I struggled to get past my own ordeal. I had risked everything out of love for him and fear of being separated, but as far as I could tell, he hadn't felt the same way. He had a lot more to lose than just me. We weren't together long when Mr. Wilhere arrived to speak to me privately. He asked Dallas to wait in the other room. "Jenna, if you get through your program, you'll be fine," he began. "Most people would go to the RPF for what you've done, but you're lucky. It looks like you're going to be spared." "What about Dallas?" I asked. "I don't really care about Dallas. He'll probably be thrown to the sharks." So Dallas had chosen the church, and this was his reward. He was dispensable to them. He was just a tool to get me to do what they wanted, which was to not cause PR issues for the church by acting out. They didn't know what else to do with me. Soon after, Linda came to take Dallas. Emotionally and physically worn down, I was ashamed by the way I had treated him. I agreed to go home and think about the best way to approach things. No sooner had I got to my room than I realized what a mistake it had been to let Dallas go, especially after Mr. Wilhere talked about him being thrown to the sharks. Now that I knew where he was, I had to go find him before they moved him somewhere else. Eager not to repeat past mistakes, I hurriedly walked over to PAC and found him in a room, with a security guard posted outside the door. That night, I slept in a room with him. It was the first time we had slept in the same berthing, and I took comfort knowing I was finally close to him. Chapter 28. A New Name. The following morning, Mr. Wilhere made an announcement. The church was going to send Dallas and me somewhere to calm down and destimulate, an LRH method of dealing with someone who had gone insane. I didn't care what he said. The only words I heard were "getaway." I knew I couldn't continue as I had been. My body couldn't handle it. I only weighed 94 pounds, and there wasn't much more I could take. That day, Mr. Wilhere drove Dallas, our 2 security guards, and me up to Big Bear, where we were taken to a 2-bedroom cabin, one with bunk beds and one with a queen-sized bed. My guard and I stayed in the one with the queen, and Dallas and his stayed in the room with the bunk beds. Looking around at the comfortable cabin and the 2 guards, I couldn't understand why the church was seemingly spending so much money on us. I'd experienced many different forms of punishment in my life, but never anything quite like this. 2 days earlier, they'd seemed determined to torment me. Now, I was at a retreat. The arrangement struck me as strange, but given what life had been like, I wasn't about to complain. For the next few weeks, the 4 of us just hung out, cooked, hiked, swam in the lake, and read books aloud to each other. Once a week, someone would come by to visit and bring us mail, any clothes that we needed, and food. I felt guilty about all the money and resources being spent on me. We'd been there about a week when Sylvia Pearl arrived to continue my sec checking and stay in a cabin near ours. However, her presence didn't work out. I still couldn't handle the security checking, and again I just walked out of the sessions. At the same time, Dallas was being sec-checked too, except his questions were about me, as they tried to get him to report on me, which only made me angrier. In time, Sylvia was replaced with an RTC auditor, and eventually with some difficulty we finished my sec check. Mr. Wilhere came up once a week to check on me, bringing with him any news that he cared to share. It was during one of these visits that he told me there had been a significant development in the Lisa McPherson case. Bob Minton, the key financier in the civil case brought by her family, had changed sides. He was no longer supporting the cause of Lisa McPherson, but instead was supporting the church. I remembered that Bob Minton had been the leader of the Lisa McPherson Trust at the base. OSA often referred to him when talking about our enemies who were picketing and trying to bring down the church. Minton and his wife had been the most vocal opponents at the Flagland base. He had testified at a court hearing that the lawyer representing the McPherson estate had made him lie, change court documents, and pump up anti-Scientology sentiment. The McPherson family lawyer responded by saying that Minton had been extorted by the church. Already the criminal charges against the church had been dismissed in 2000 after the medical examiner changed the cause of death from unknown to accident. Aside from periodic stories from outside, our stay at Big Bear was incredibly secluded and peaceful. I never learned exactly why I was sent there. It could have been to make my parents happy. It could have been because I had threatened suicide, which meant that I was insane and a potential trouble source. It could have been that I was a miscavige, and the only alternative at that point would have been having me leave, thus creating bad PR. I'm sure they assumed that isolating me at Big Bear would settle me, make me happy, and allow enough time for the whole incident to blow over without other people seeing that my punishment wasn't so harsh. Whatever the church's intentions were, staying there did help me to calm down. Before Big Bear, I was an accident waiting to happen, but after weeks without fear of losing Dallas or having him taken away, and eating and sleeping properly, I'd finally regained my footing. However, it didn't put an end to my doubt of the church. In fact, in some ways, I left Big Bear more determined than ever not to give in to their demands. I knew there were things about Scientology that I disagreed with. The invasive questions, the pointless auditing, the endless security checks. And I understood that while these things had helped some people, all I'd ever gotten from them was aggravation. Furthermore, I found it completely unfair and unreasonable that I had to be punished over and over again for things that weren't my fault. As I looked back on what I'd been through, one thing was clear to me. The only way that people in the church would stop taking advantage of me was for me to say no to them, even if it pushed them to the edge. At times, this attitude put me at odds with Dallas. While he too had issues with the church and found a lot to suspect in how they'd treated us, he struggled to understand why I refused to cooperate and do the various punishments they gave me. In his eyes, we should tolerate these things, get them over with, and move on. To me, that would only result in them pushing us around more. The more power we gave them over us, the more they would take. As long as we weren't married, nothing had really changed. Everything that had happened before could still happen again, and until we were married, we would always be at risk. Sure enough, when we returned home after 6 weeks, that risk was made perfectly clear. Before we all went back to LA, Mr. Wilhere came to talk to me and let me know what our fate would be. Dallas and I were going to be removed from our posts at the Flag Liaison Office, demoted, and posted at the PAC base doing manual labor in the mill, where the carpentry jobs were carried out. Their final warning was that we were on the verge of being RPF'd. The idea of doing manual labor at the PAC base wasn't that bad. It would have been nice to have less responsibility. We would be doing carpentry. What I objected to was the fact that we were right back where we'd been 6 weeks earlier, still being punished for the same supposed crimes. Our out 2D, my suicide attempt, insubordinations, the list just went on. They had paid for us to go to Big Bear, only to return us to our lives in exactly the same place, receiving an unjust punishment that we were simply expected to take. We were guilty in their eyes and had to pay the price. Dallas agreed to work at the mill. I refused. After several weeks in limbo, things were finally settled. I was going to remain at CMO IXU and be posted at the landlord office at Flow as a renderer, meaning I would render designs and help put design boards together. Dallas was transferred back to PAC, which was considered a lower org. Even though the two were just a few miles apart, they were separate bases, so we couldn't eat together or see each other at night. Though being married doesn't guarantee husbands and wives staying together, this separation was exactly what I'd feared. Worse, when I did see Dallas, he told me he was still being security checked by Jessica Feshbach, who would soon be famous for being Katie Holmes's auditor. As had been the case with Sylvia at Big Bear, he told me that his sessions were being used to find out about me, not him. This enraged me all over again. Dallas was upset too, and together we wrote letters to Mr. Rathbun and Mr. Wilhere, requesting that we be together at Flow. Mr. Rathbun never wrote back, and Mr. Wilhere told me that I cared only about my first and second dynamics, myself and Dallas, and I didn't care for anything else, like the group or our mission to save mankind. When his response arrived, I shredded it and sent it back to him, which only got me in more trouble. Despite how rebellious I was being, I still wasn't sent to the RPF. Instead, I was honing my ability to say no. The realization I'd had at Big Bear meant that they could only control me if I were willing to accept their treatment. For whatever reason, they wanted me to stay, which meant that the church was in a compromised position, simultaneously trying to punish me for things I'd done while attempting to keep me calm. So I pushed back on everything I disagreed with, which by that point was quite a lot. Even though I was unhappy, I couldn't bring myself to take the next step and leave the church. All the ingredients were there, but as long as Dallas remained committed to the church, I couldn't truly contemplate leaving if we wouldn't be together. They'd almost succeeded in splitting us up when we were both in the church, so I couldn't imagine what would happen if I left and he stayed. My involvement in Scientology became mostly about Dallas. Frustrated as I was, I tolerated it because it enabled us to stay together. It was a relationship worth saving. As a result, I limited my behavior to criticism and insubordination, rather than all-out mutiny. We still held out hope that our marriage would become a reality. Despite the fact that Dallas and I didn't always agree as to how we would get out of the mess we were in, we still wanted the same thing, to be together. We were best friends and loved each other. Everything we had been through had only brought us closer, and one way or another we were determined to emerge from all of this as husband and wife. Several weeks after our return from Big Bear, I was told that I needed to get onto the daily van run to INT, which was odd, since I hadn't been there in years. I spent 2 hours on the van wondering who I would be meeting and why. My meeting was with Mr. Wilhere, and it was about marrying Dallas. He wanted us to hold on a little bit longer, saying things weren't resolved with Dallas's uncle yet. Unsurprisingly, handling Uncle Larry was never ending. I told him that I would be willing to cooperate and hold on a little bit longer if he was willing to have Dallas posted at Flow so that we could at least be together. He agreed so quickly that it surprised me. With that out of the way, I figured that since the only reason they cared about Uncle Larry was based on the premise of my parents coming to the wedding and the possible ensuing conspiracy, I told him I was sure they would be willing to not come, if that was the problem. I could just write them a letter saying as much. To my surprise, after thinking about it, he had me write one, watching while I untruthfully described how happy I was and how well I was doing. I told them I had found someone whom I loved, and that I thought they would love him too. I had my own life now, I told them, and I hoped they understood. I didn't ask them not to come to the wedding, but I hoped that they would get the gist without me having to spell it out. Mr. Wilhere kept his word. The next day, Dallas was posted as a typesetter in the dissemination division at Flow. This division was responsible for creating promotional pieces for Scientology materials, magazines, and other publications. We were now able to spend meal times together, see each other occasionally throughout the day, and even take the same bus back to the berthing at night. A few weeks later, Mr. Wilhere unexpectedly arrived in the office, saying that he needed to speak to me. He handed me a letter from my parents, already opened. They said they were no longer in Mexico and were now living in Virginia. They said how happy they were for me, and that they understood about not attending my wedding. I was pleased with their words, but a bit baffled by how it had all unfolded. What I didn't know was that my Uncle Dave had actually traveled to the East Coast on church business and had hand-delivered my letter to them, proving just how aware Uncle Dave was of what had been going on with me. According to what my parents told me, my uncle, along with his entourage, met them at a fancy hotel in Washington, D.C., where Uncle Dave was staying. Not only did he give my parents my letter, he hooked my father up with a local real estate guy for employment guidance and found my mother a job at a law office. He also told my parents they were no longer SPs. They had lived in Mexico as the church had asked of them and had basically done their AE steps required for someone to become undeclared, or no longer an SP. At the meeting, Uncle Dave said my father could now talk to their mother, something my dad had wanted to do. With regard to my wedding, my mother said that she had expected to hear that I was getting married, being in the Sea Org, so the news wasn't surprising. Uncle Dave had told them he had heard that Dallas was a nice guy, but that he didn't know him. Of course, I knew nothing about this at the time. I was simply relieved that they weren't coming to my wedding. It was only after I left the church that I heard the story from my mother. "So," Mr. Wilhere asked sardonically, "are you going to get married tomorrow?" I could tell how annoyed he was that I was about to get everything I wanted and had even gotten Dallas to be posted at the base. "Pretty much," I answered, unapologetically. "Well, good luck," he said, mumbling some obligatory advice on how to have a good marriage. I barely heard what he said. I was going to be married. Early the next morning, Dallas and I drove to the courthouse to get our marriage license. We were too nervous and excited to notice that the car was almost out of gas and had to coast down a hill to get to the gas station. Dallas's gas cap had to be opened with a key. He was shaking so much that it broke off in the keyhole when he tried to open it. He borrowed pliers from the gas station attendant and fished out the broken part, which took almost an hour. We prayed that it would work when we put it into the ignition, cheering ecstatically when it did. We paid with the $5 worth of change we had saved from our pay. I could only imagine what the attendant thought when we handed her the pile of mostly dimes and nickels. We still had to coast a lot of the way to the courthouse, because the gas wasn't necessarily going to get us as far as we needed to go. When we finally arrived, we had to leave the car unlocked because the key was still stuck in the ignition. But we got our marriage license. Dallas's dad was a Scientology minister as well as a jeweler, and had agreed to come to Los Angeles to perform a quick ceremony. The plan was to meet him at the Celebrity Center at midnight, as that was when we got off work. To my surprise, Dallas's mother, his sister and her boyfriend, and his brother, wife, and baby girl were all there too. The only one who was not a public Scientologist was his sister's boyfriend. Two of my friends, Phil and Claire, were my chosen witnesses. There was no Biddy and Ronnie Miscavige, no Uncle Dave or Aunt Shelley, and no Uncle Larry. I got pretty emotional that Dallas's family was there to make it special. Even though I didn't know them well, they had obviously cared enough about us to make the 2-hour drive from San Diego. It wasn't exactly the wedding of my dreams. Dallas and I were both in our uniforms. I hadn't even touched up my makeup, and my shoes were caked with spray glue from that day's design boards. The ceremony was 5 minutes long. No flowers, no fancy food, no champagne or music, but none of that mattered. We were married now. I still cherish the moment that Dallas placed the ring on my finger. I promised myself that no matter what it took, I would protect him and take care of him, and I would never be separated from him again. I knew that it was wrong to make him more important to me than the church, but I didn't care. We had finally done it. On September 20th, 2002, I became Jenna Hill. Chapter 29. Australia. Dallas and I were given no time to enjoy our special moment. I had to return to work immediately, where I stayed up all night finishing design boards. In the morning, we had breakfast on the down low at Denny's with Dallas's parents. We weren't supposed to eat out like this when it wasn't a Sunday morning, but we did it anyway. That day, I proudly told anyone who would listen that Dallas and I were married, and that I was now Jenna Hill. I was delighted to distance myself from the Miscavige name, but even though my name was different, It didn't change the fact that sooner or later Dallas would have to meet my family. In December 2002, Dallas and I were given permission to celebrate our first Christmas together with a trip to San Diego to spend the holiday with Dallas's family, followed by a trip to Clearwater to see Grandma Loretta and Aunt Denise, then to see my parents in Virginia. Everyone in Dallas's family was incredibly nice, possibly the nicest people I had ever met. His parents' house was a log home, as cozy as they come, with a stone fireplace. The flannel sheets on all the beds and the soft lighting made everything warm and inviting. The feeling of home hung in the air. The familial setting was so contrary to the communal upbringing I had experienced. After San Diego, Dallas and I flew to Clearwater, followed by Virginia, where we arrived on a gorgeous snowy day. It was really odd to see my parents in their little house with a fire crackling in the fireplace, just like at Dallas's parents' house. My mother had even cooked a meal for us, which really surprised me. It was foreign yet familiar at the same time. Being there made me feel as though I perhaps did have a place to come home to, at least for the holidays. Over the next couple of days, Mom and Dad showed us around their community and told us about their lives. They seemed to be doing really well. I had anticipated that being with them would be really strained, but it wasn't. My mom loved decorating her new house and made it sound like a lot of fun. Strangely, my father's Christmas present to us was a television and a VCR DVD player, which was awesome, but against church rules. We would just have to keep it well hidden. By the time we left, I felt almost like I had a family with parents who were truly there for me, that maybe it wasn't just Dallas and me after all. For the first time since I was little, I felt as though I really did have a mother and father whom I could turn to in time of need. When we got back to California, our little room on the base looked drearier than ever, but at least it was our own place. One of the perks of being married was that Dallas and I got our own room, small as it was. With our own space, I now felt like I had a family of my own, even if it was just the two of us. Together, we had a place to go that was ours. We could also eat together, and in the unlikely event we ever had time off, we could spend it together. We received a couple of Christmas presents that made it look homier, which helped. Aunt Denise had given us some curtains, and my grandma had given us a quilt. I was given permission to talk to my parents on the phone, which was huge, having been forbidden to speak to them for more than 2 years. Being married felt like a huge sigh of relief, and while it didn't make any of my issues with the church disappear, it encouraged them to stay dormant for longer periods of time, long enough to settle into a routine as best we could. I couldn't forget the past, but I didn't have to confront it every day. Dallas and I had been married a little over a year when my senior at the landlord office told me I had been selected to go on a mission to Canberra, Australia. There was a small, failing Scientology church there, and I was to go on a mission to find a new building for it and raise the funds to buy the building. When I heard that this mission was going to be at least 6 months long, I freaked out a little. I didn't want to be away from Dallas for so long. From my own experience, I knew how common it was for husbands and wives to be split up by their jobs in the church. In addition to my parents and other people I'd known over the years who'd been in a similar situation, there was a woman in the landlord office who had been separated from her husband for 9 years. I had 2 friends who had been posted away from their spouses for 2 years and were now both divorced. Dallas and I were going to do whatever we could to make sure this didn't happen to us, so I proposed that Dallas go on this mission with me. I sent a telex to the INT landlord with Dallas's qualifications, and the next thing I heard was that he had been approved for the mission as well. It was odd that they had agreed so easily, but I wasn't going to complain. Neither Dallas nor I had ever been on a mission before, which made the whole thing even more odd. In addition, our pre-mission clearance process was strange. People going on these long-term assignments were supposed to get opportunity checks when they were questioned as to their motives to go on a particular mission. Dallas and I did not get one. We were also supposed to be issued full mission orders with comprehensive targets, approved by RTC, read by us, star rate checked out for our full understanding of them, and finally, each target demonstrated by us in clay. None of this happened. We were given mission orders that appeared to have been written 2 minutes before we departed for the airport. Even these were hastily constructed, copied, and pasted on top of somebody else's earlier orders. Our mission orders still read, Find a building in Kentucky. The whole thing was extremely peculiar. Why this mission and why us? It seemed as though it was some sort of plan to take us off lines, or out of sight. Neither of us had any idea what was behind this, but we didn't ask too many questions. We were just grateful to be going to Australia together. In January 2004, we boarded our plane for the 18-hour flight to Sydney, Australia, and from the moment we stepped off the airplane, it was clear that Australia was going to be quite an experience. From the start, we had a lot more freedom in Canberra. We could walk to wherever we were going. We even bought ourselves bikes to get around, as renting a car was too expensive. This was the first time I really had to navigate the world on my own in any way. Clearwater had had far more Scientologists. In Canberra, there were only a handful of them. Everywhere around us, there were wogs. At first I was a little worried, but as I met more of them, I became more comfortable. The church covered our living expenses, paying for our apartment and our food, although it was often a struggle to get this money on time. I had to learn how to cook, as my whole life I had been fed by a galley. Not having a mess hall was a strange adjustment. It made me feel like we were constantly dealing with food throughout the day, whether it was grocery shopping or actually cooking. At first I was afraid of the stove, so Dallas did most of the cooking. We'd also eat out once in a while. Eventually I tried following recipes and had fun with it, but the meals almost always turned out disastrously. Everything I made was disgusting. Learning how to cook was just the tip of the iceberg. Probably our biggest challenge was the job itself. We were supposed to find a new Scientology church building in Canberra, raise the funds to buy it, purchase the building, and have it renovated. Because Scientology was in the process of trying to standardize the layouts for all their new churches, the building itself had to be a minimum of 25,000 square feet, or it wouldn't be approved. In addition, it had to be on a busy street, not too industrial, preferably something more traditional and decorative so it had the look of a church. As we did our research, it quickly became clear that a building fitting all those specifics would have cost several million Australian dollars. And there was the problem. In all of Canberra, there were only about 15 to 20 practicing Scientologists. The whole operation in Canberra was quite different from what our mission orders had described. In fact, the whole organization in Canberra was composed of 10 people who only delivered intro courses. There was not even auditing, the primary service of any Scientology organization. Not only that, but they were being kicked out of their premises as they had not paid the rent for 6 months. The church's lists for potential donors included anyone who had ever given their name to the church for a course, stress test, or any other purpose, the majority of whom had never come back. Complicating things was that Dallas and I had never raised a dime in our lives. The third person on our 3-person team had some fundraising experience and had been on many other missions, but she was quickly recalled home, leaving us there on our own. Still, we were given an impossible task. The idea of raising several $1 million from a group of approximately 15 public Scientologists, none of whom earned more than $80,000, was ridiculous. Additionally, many of those Scientologists had already paid for services that the Canberra church wasn't able to deliver, so asking them for money seemed wrong. We brought up these observations in our daily reports, but we were nonetheless pushed to get them to donate. In addition, we were not allowed to raise funds from other Australian orgs, as they were doing their own fundraising. We ended up raising $75,000, the result of a lot of promotion and small fundraising events like raffles, games, and shows. Looking back, this was pretty good for people who had never raised a dime in their lives. It was largely possible because of a few friends we made there who knew a lot of people and helped us make connections and raise the money. Still, we were told this amount was not acceptable, and eventually Dallas and I started running out of ways to raise more. Unless they changed the mission plans or the specs of the building we were supposed to purchase, we had done everything we could. We had asked to come home several times, but it wasn't allowed. Still, Dallas and I struggled to keep asking the same people for money. I could see these people's lives, and I knew that they really couldn't afford to donate. This was not something that either of us had ever encountered, and we were in disagreement with the church about what we were being asked to do. The focus was not on building a church to deliver Scientology by which to make money. It seemed more about making money and having a nice-looking building. They wanted the new buildings to be filled with gimmicks and high-tech video displays, but all this seemed to trump the delivery of Scientology itself. It felt as though the focus was on the material aspects instead of Scientology, which was why we were there. Asking for money from these people in return for nothing, especially when they had already given so much, seemed greedy. The more we pushed to make money, the more we ran into the general public, not always with good results. In one fundraising effort, we made promotional pieces and sent them to the public Scientologists on our list. Sometimes we would get them back with rude things written on them. I remember one person said that L. Ron Hubbard was a fraud and that we were all idiots. I was surprised, especially when we received 10 or so others with similar sentiments. Based on everything that we heard from Uncle Dave and the senior members of the church my whole life, I had been under the impression that everyone loved L. Ron Hubbard, and that Scientology was flourishing and expanding all over the world. However, it seemed like most people in Australia did not even know what it was, and those who did often were skeptical. In part because of the freedom that we had, we began to encounter ideas that ran in the face of Scientology's teachings. Even though it was against the rules, we started watching TV for an hour or two a day. I especially liked watching Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, a makeover show featuring 5 gay experts in home decor, food, culture, fashion, and more. I liked the characters and enjoyed the show, and found myself a bit surprised that what I saw didn't match what I'd learned in Scientology. We were taught that homosexuals were sexual perverts and covertly hostile, qualities that made them close to SPs. However, when I watched these guys on television, they didn't strike me as any of those things. It didn't make sense to me, and I just didn't see how it could be true. We also had internet access, although I didn't know how to use it very well. One time, Dallas called my attention to a website called Operation Clambake, which was highly critical of the church. When we saw what it was, Dallas and I looked at each other in disbelief, knowing we had stumbled on something we weren't supposed to, but neither of us could deny it was interesting. We had to exercise self-restraint, but what we did see was pretty revealing. One story in particular on the site said that Uncle Dave had usurped power when he took over the church. That was the first negative implication about his leadership that I had heard. I was a bit curious about the site, but didn't fully understand how websites worked. I also knew that people got in trouble for looking at stuff like this. I saw that Operation Clambake mentioned OT3 materials on its site. I had been warned about what would happen if you accessed information from levels that you had not yet attained. I figured I would stay away, because I didn't want to go crazy. Still, I couldn't fully shake the allegations from the website about my uncle. I knew Scientology had detractors because of the protesters at the Flagland base, but I hadn't known there were whole websites devoted to opposing Scientology, or how much a part of everyday life the internet was. The fact that Dallas had come across this site so easily surprised me, but it was also somehow satisfying, although I didn't really know why. It was almost like the moment at the ranch all those years ago when I'd seen the outside contractors and secretly wished that they would advocate for us. It felt like there was an awareness of what our experiences were in Scientology that was reassuring, even if that awareness wouldn't necessarily change anything. When I called my parents that night, I asked them if the story about Uncle Dave could be true. They said they didn't know much about it, but they were not sure that the internet was a reliable source of information. Because my parents brushed it off, it sort of left my mind for a bit. It wasn't just things that we read and saw that deepened our thinking about the church. It was the people we met and the vastly different lifestyle we were living. Gone was our incessant regimentation and constant security checks. Instead, we were actually getting to live our lives, more than before at least. In Canberra, we became friends with most of the public Scientologists there, especially since they were our only source for our fundraising. Spending time with them gave me a chance to experience what life would be like if Dallas and I were public Scientologists, living on our own. I had never been around Scientology staff that worked at the church and moonlighted with normal jobs. It wasn't just the lifestyle, it was also the presence of the church that started to change us. I started to see that places like Flag and INT were the exception, not the rule. I had always heard that there were 500 Scientology churches around the world, and I thought they were all on a similar scale to Flag, or at least close to it. Clearly, I hadn't really thought it through. To see this small, struggling church in Canberra, and then be around this small handful of casual Scientologists, was to become aware that Scientology wasn't taking over the world in the way we'd always been told. Of all these experiences, perhaps the most eye-opening wasn't anything subversive or illicit. It was my friendship with a lady named Jeanette. When we met her, she had 2 little girls and a baby boy on the way. We spent a lot of time with her, coming over for her kids' birthday parties and just hanging out. Her 2-year-old Eden was so precious. She was full of quirks and mischief, and I spent a lot of time around her. When I went to the org, I would sometimes carry her with me and play with her there, even though I was supposed to be a Sea Org member on a mission. I was aware of the effect Eden had on me, but it just seemed natural. I couldn't really help myself. Still, the way I was acting was considered unbecoming of a Sea Org member on a mission. Jeanette was pregnant, which was also something that I hadn't really been around before. She would tell me about it, and it just seemed like such an amazing thing for a so-called meat body to be capable of. I felt as though I could ask Jeanette about anything. We saw her in the days after her son was born, and it seemed like such an incredible thing. All this time with Jeanette and Eden got me thinking, in a way in which I never had before, about what it would be like to have a family. Dallas was also great with her. He loved to pick her up and twirl her around until she burst out giggling. He adored children and always remarked about how cute and special they were. But knowing kids were not allowed for Sea Org members, the thought of being a mother hadn't really occurred to me. Yet for the first time ever, I found myself wondering if I was missing out. A year went by, and there was still no end in sight to our mission. While we enjoyed our time there, we tried hard to follow the rules and not go too far off the rails. Even though we tried some new things, we still were very beholden to the church and our responsibilities. Looking back, I wish we hadn't been so afraid and had gone to the beach and other places. However, we weren't at a place where we were comfortable dismissing the church's rules so blatantly. Overall, though, the year was refreshing. I no longer felt on edge because of my frustrations with the church. Because the level of monitoring we faced was so much less than what it had been, it made it much easier to put aside the issues with which I'd been struggling. Even though I still disagreed with aspects of the church, I was more relaxed than I'd been in years, not to mention well-fed, well-rested, and having a lot of fun. Christmas 2004 rolled around, and although we got permission to come home for the holidays, Dallas's parents had to pay for our round-trip flights. My dad then flew us to Virginia, where my Grandma Loretta was going to meet us, but at the last minute she canceled her trip, saying she wasn't feeling well. I was sorry that I hadn't been able to see her, as she was the person I was most looking forward to spending time with. On our way back to Australia, Dallas and I stopped by the landlord office in LA to receive what were supposed to be our revised mission orders. The new landlord told us, completely unexpectedly, that we were going to be posted at the Sea Org base in Sydney. We were shocked. When we asked when we were supposed to return to California, he said never, that Sydney was to be our new Sea Org post. It was so out of the ordinary for anything like this to happen. More important, it was against church policy. We hadn't even properly terminated our Canberra mission. No one had even worked out posts for us or done transfers for the Sydney job. We expressed complete outrage at this development, but in the end, we went to Sydney on the promise that we weren't being posted there, that we were only on a mission and would receive our mission orders shortly. They never came. We were in Sydney for 2 weeks, demanding to receive our mission orders. When that failed, we demanded to come home. It was at this time that I learned that my grandmother had passed away. She was found in her car, not breathing, in a mall parking lot. She was in a coma and never woke up. I was told that her death was a result of her emphysema. I cried uncontrollably that day. It was horrible to think that I would never be able